Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a truly wild journey. We're going to start off by looking at some cutting-edge biology and actually end up exploring a pretty profound philosophical paradigm shift. You see, for the longest time, we viewed the tiny creatures that share our planet, the insects, the fish, the bugs, as essentially mindless biological robots that just kind of react to stimuli. But modern science, it's completely upending that assumption. We're going to look closely at what researchers are actually measuring in the lab right now, and then we'll examine how our source material takes these scientific findings and applies a really fascinating theological lens to answer the mysteries that science basically leaves behind. It's a fantastic, mind-bending journey today, so let's just get right into it. So, first off, can a fish go through a painful breakup? I mean, it sounds literally like the plot of an animated kids movie, right? We naturally attribute human emotions like heartbreak, grief, and pessimism to ourselves, and, well, maybe to our dogs or cats. But a fish? I really want to hook you immediately with this idea, because what we're about to explore throughout this explainer isn't some human projection, and it's definitely not fiction. This is documented scientific reality. All right, let's dive into Section 1, the heartbroken fish. To kick things off, let's look at our very first case study. Researchers over at Burgundy University in France studied this highly monogamous species of cichlid fish. They're known as Amatitlania sicua. Basically, these fish pair up. They choose a specific mate. Well, the researchers took these female fish and placed them in aquariums, but here's the catch, not with the mate they had chosen, but with a totally different male. The results were published in the prestigious journal, The Proceedings of the Royal Society B, and they were absolutely astonishing. The female fish didn't just act a little confused. They became demonstrably pessimistic. They exhibited behaviors that, if we were talking about humans, we would immediately describe as demoralization and heartbreak. They experienced a severe, measurable drop in morale. This wasn't just some biological glitch. It was a deep, undeniable emotional response to separation.
Which brings us to Section 2. Bugs are not robots.
Because if a fish can feel heartbreak, what about even smaller, seemingly simpler creatures? We're moving past vertebrates entirely now. What's so fascinating here is the sheer variety of creatures exhibiting these complex traits. For instance, a team led by researchers at Queen Mary University of London conducted experiments where bees were given just a tiny amount of sweet syrup. And the result? Published in Science magazine, it showed that these bees began to act as though they were experiencing positive emotions, essentially a buzz of happiness and optimism. Meanwhile, over at the State University of New York, researchers studying termite colonies observed something equally incredible. They found that termites actively seek comfort. They literally groom each other, licking one another continuously until the other termite appears completely calm and peaceful. They are actively trying to fulfill a need for peace. Professor Scott Turner from SUNY, who spent years studying those exact termites, puts it incredibly powerfully. He says, these are not robots, they are creatures with personalities, desires, and wants. Just think about that for a second. Turner makes this brilliant observation in our source material. A machine, right, a biological robot, would never desire to be groomed. Your Roomba absolutely does not care if you pet it. Yet termites clearly desire this comfort. They seek it out. They have a totally measurable need for emotional peace. And he's certainly not alone in this paradigm shift. Professor Lars Chicka stated back in 2022 that his goal is to convince people that every bee has a mind and a capacity to feel basic emotions. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. We aren't just talking about fringe internet theories. These are top-tier researchers publishing in premier scientific journals, proving beyond a doubt that insects can appreciate the consequences of their actions and, well, genuinely feel. So let's unpack what this means in Section 3, the mystery of emotion. These discoveries are creating massive cognitive dissonance for traditional biology. It perfectly illustrates our current scientific conflict. The old assumption was straightforward. Lacking a complex mammalian emotion center in their tiny brains meant these creatures were just mindless biological robots. Case closed. But the new reality? It completely shatters that. Emotions are actively being measured and documented. Regardless of their brain structure, these tiny creatures have distinct desires and wants. The empirical evidence is just undeniable at this point. Which leads us directly to the pivotal question posed by our source material. Who put these emotions inside them? If a fish suffers from separation anxiety, if a bee actually feels joy, and a termite likes to be pampered, where does that actually come from? This is the exact moment in our explainer where the narrative shifts from empirical, measurable evidence straight into the philosophical unknown. And that brings us to Section 4, an unidentifiable principle. Because eventually, empirical research hits a wall. The scientists themselves recognize this boundary. After all his observations, Professor Scott Turner concluded that there is an animating principle not found in machines, an unidentifiable thing that separates the presence and absence of life. Science itself is basically holding its hands up here. It admits there is a mysterious, unidentifiable spark that distinguishes a living, feeling creature from a lifeless robot. Science tells us the emotions are for sure there, but it cannot definitively tell us what that animating spark actually is.
Which sets the stage for our final section, Section 5, a universal mercy. When empirical science hits this exact wall, the source material we're examining today pivots. It transitions to a theological framework to answer this scientific mystery. The source introduces the concept of rahmet, which is an Arabic term translating to mercy. The source impartially frames this divine mercy as the actual answer to the scientist's unidentifiable thing. So according to this theological perspective, this isn't just some abstract philosophical concept. It's presented as a literal, universal biological emotion that is fundamentally woven into the fabric of all creatures. It's the reason the fish feels the loss of a partner, the bee feels the joy of the nectar, and the termite seeks the peace of grooming. The source essentially argues that mercy is the operating system of life itself.
To support this conclusion, our source material relies on a very specific verse. My mercy encompasses all things. This is from the Quran, Surah Al-Araf, verse 156. The author of our source draws a direct and honestly fascinating parallel here. They suggest that this ancient text perfectly mirrors the modern scientific findings we just reviewed. All things doesn't just mean humans. It literally encompasses all things, including the fish in the aquarium, the bees in the garden, and the termites in the dirt. According to this framework, that mysterious, unidentifiable capacity for feeling that scientists are busy measuring in the lab is, in fact, the direct manifestation of this all-encompassing mercy.
We have traveled from the heartbreak of a tiny fish to the vast concept of universal mercy, which really leaves us with a profound question to chew on. Will you ever look at a tiny insect the same way again? The next time you see a bee hovering over a flower, or even a fish just swimming in a tank, remember this incredible connection between cutting-edge science and spiritual philosophy. They aren't robots. They're creatures experiencing their own sliver of life's vast emotional spectrum. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and hey, keep questioning the incredible world around you.